Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day, and today we're going to be talking about Hamilton's plan. So we have a few vocab words. Our first one is national debt, the amount of money a government owes to other governments or to its people. 8th grade, the amount of money a government spends over the amount it takes in. And it's hard to pay off because of the interest, and the amount keeps growing, which puts the country in a weak position. Here's the national debt clock, and you can see today our national debt is over $18 trillion. Second word, bond, a note issued by the government which promises to pay off a loan with interest. A certificate you buy from the government which is worth more when you cash it in years later. It's a way to make money. Now here's a picture of a war bond that was used back in the 1940s during World War II. And basically what these are used for is the government borrows money from the people. So the people will give them $50 cash for this one. The government will give them this $50 bond, and when the war is over, the government pays back $50 plus interest on the bond. Next word is speculator, a person who risks money in order to make a large profit. Someone who buys land to sell it for more than they bought it for. Speculators were often looked at as villains who preyed on the needy because they looked for people who needed money, and they would take advantage of their situation and buy things for less than what they were worth, and then they would sell them for more later. Tariff, a tax on imports or exports, a way for the government to make money on imports or exports. Tariffs protect American businesses by keeping American prices lower than their foreign competitors. For example, in this drawing you have American-made cloth. The cheapest they can sell it for and make money is $4 a roll. Then you have English-made cloth, and the cheapest they can make it for is $4 a roll. Well, if England wants to sell it in the United States, then they have to pay a $1 tariff per roll, so their price now becomes $5 a roll, and that's how tariffs protect American businesses, because they keep our prices lower. Now, if both of these items are basically the same, most people are going to buy the cheaper item, and in this case it would be American. So, financial problems. George Washington, when he took office at first, he rarely proposed laws. And he almost always approved the bills that Congress passed. The reason he did this was because they were setting up the government at the time. And a lot of the stuff that came across Washington's desk were things that they needed to get the government up and running. Like the federal court system. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the federal court system. Well, he's not going to veto something that they need like that. And there were a lot of things that came across his desk that they needed, so he approved almost all of them. He kind of concentrated on foreign affairs and military matters. These were the things he knew best, and so that's what he focused on. He left the governor's economic policies to the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The new nation faced serious problems. The national debt was growing. Here's a modern-day national debt chart. You can see in 2008 we owed $9 trillion. In 2011 we owed $14 trillion, and you saw earlier that we now owe $18 trillion. It's very bad. Hamilton's plan was to improve the country's financial reputation and strengthen the nation at the same time. So Hamilton believed that if the government paid the states, they would have a strong interest in the federal government being successful. Here's an example of that. If I owed each one of you guys $1,000, would you want me to lose my job? And the answer is no, because if I lost my job, then I couldn't pay you the $1,000. Well, he felt the same way about the states. If the federal government offered to pay the states' debts, then they would want the federal government to be successful so they could get their money. So in 1790, Hamilton proposed that the new government pay off the millions of dollars in debts owed by the Confederation government, or the government that we had when we fought the war, to other countries and to the individual American citizens. He argued that the states had fought hard to win independence, and the national government should pay the cost. Well, there was opposition to his plan in Congress. Congress didn't have any problem paying the other countries, but when it came to paying the American citizens back off for those bonds, it was an issue. During the Revolution, the government had borrowed money from the people in the form of bonds, and the people got to the point where they needed money very badly. So when some speculators came around and offered to buy their bonds for lesser value, or maybe even sometimes half value, they sold their bonds to these investors because they needed the cash. Well, Hamilton said we need to pay off these bonds at full value. But the representatives in Congress thought, well, that's going to make all those speculators rich, and we don't really want to do that. The original bond owners felt betrayed by the government because they lost money. Well, these original bond owners nobody forced them to sell those bonds to the speculators, but they needed the money, and I can see their side of it. They were trying to help the government win the war by buying the bonds, but ultimately they decided to pay off the bonds at full value. The bigger problem came from representatives of the southern states, because during the war, the South had accumulated a lot less war debt, and they had paid most of it off. Well, if the federal government paid off the money the states owed, it would give a lot less money to the southern states because they owed a lot less. The North hadn't paid any of their war debt off. So ultimately, this would make the South pay more than the North because they've already paid some. They're going to get a little bit from the federal government, but the North had not paid any, and they're going to get a lot from the federal government. So the southern states were completely against this. Well, Hamilton decided to make a deal with the southern representatives so they would support his plan. If the South agreed to back his plan, then and allow him to take over the debts of the northern states, then he agreed to move the new federal capital into the South, which would be Washington, D.C. Now, the southern representatives jumped all over this idea because this was a good deal for them. They were basically trading millions of dollars from the federal government for billions of dollars and a great economy over time. Because if you think about it, before they built Washington, D.C. where it is, there was nothing there except for trees and the river and dirt. Well, they were going to need everything. They were going to need houses. They were going to need buildings. They were going to need businesses. And that would bring people in there to do those things. It was going to build their economy. So everyone that lived around this whole area would benefit greatly over time for this city to be built there. So this would be good for the South, so they agreed to it, and he got their backing. So Hamilton had other things that he needed to include in his plan. He needed a national bank. He needed tariffs and taxes. Well, when he proposed the national bank, they started arguing about it. Here's Hamilton. We need a strong national bank. The Democrats and Jefferson, no, we need small state banks. So in 1792, there were only 8 banks in the country, and they were all state banks. Hamilton thought he needed a national bank to make his plan work. If he was going to be collecting taxes, what were they going to do with the money? He didn't want to put it in a state bank. He wanted his own bank. So he thought he needed a bank to pay off, to be able to pay off the southern states and collect all the money that he was going to be collecting. Jefferson, Democrat, believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson thought if it didn't say you could do it in the Constitution, then you couldn't. So the Democrats were opposed to the idea from the start. They thought it was unconstitutional. Now, Hamilton, a Federalist, believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He thought if it didn't say you couldn't do it, then you could. He said even though the Constitution did not specifically say that Congress could create a bank, Congress still had the power to do so. Hamilton justified the bank with the elastic clause in the Constitution. Now, if you look on page 236 in your books, it lists the enumerated or the numbered powers that Congress has, and there's 18 of them listed. Well, number 18 is the elastic clause. Number 1 says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. So the first power is to they can tax. Number 2 says to borrow money. Number 3 says to regulate trade, and so on and so forth. Well, number 18 says this. Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This means they can make any law they need to carry out the first 17 powers listed in the Constitution. So, for instance, Hamilton used this clause to justify the bank. It says that you can borrow money. Well, to borrow money, you have to be able to pay money back. And Hamilton thought, well, is there a better way to pay money back than to have your own bank and to be able to pay it back? He used the elastic clause to justify the bank. The elastic clause again basically says Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying out of their job. It's kind of a powerful clause in the Constitution, and it makes the federal government very powerful. Hamilton thought he needed a bank to do his job, and Washington agreed with Hamilton, so they signed the bill. Tariffs and taxes. During this time, most Americans were farmers, and Hamilton thought that developing manufacturing would make America's economy stronger. Hamilton proposed a tariff on imports to encourage people to buy American because imports would be more expensive. Well, the South opposed the tariff because they had very little industry in the South, and all it did for them was raise prices. Well, Hamilton ended up getting his tariff, but not to protect American businesses. They did it so the government would be able to earn money off these tariffs. By the 1790s, tariffs provided 90% of the federal government's revenue. That's the way the government made money, was off tariffs. Well, the final part of Hamilton's plan involved creating national taxes. The government needed more money to operate and pay the interest on the national debt, so Congress approved several taxes, including a controversial one on whiskey. Now here's a political cartoon on the whiskey tax, and you can see that here's a tax collector, and these guys want to tar and feather him, and here's a tax collector getting tar and feathered. So the farmers weren't very happy about this whiskey tax. Hamilton's economic programs gave the national government new financial powers. His ideas split Congress and the nation. The opponents, including the Democrats, Jefferson and Madison, feared a national government with too strong economic powers dominated by the wealthy class. And they didn't like this because they had a bad experience with England and the king. Jefferson and Madison had a very different idea of what America should become. So, the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, before I want to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, I want to review Shays' Rebellion. Now, remember, during Shays' Rebellion, the state government of Massachusetts was taking farmers' farms away from them when they couldn't pay the bills. And Daniel Shays got all the farmers together, and they raided the courthouses and put locks on them so the judges couldn't rule against them and take their farms away. Well, the federal government at the time wasn't very strong, and they really couldn't do anything about this. Finally, merchants got together, and private individuals raised an army to go fight against Shays' army. And when Shay found out about it, he attacked an armory to try to get some weapons. Well, when they got to the armory, they blasted the cannons into the crowd, and Shays' rebellion was over. But this scared a lot of the American leaders because Shays' rebellion was almost successful, and the federal government really had no power to do anything about it. So what's significant about Shays' rebellion is this is the event that prompted them to change the Articles of Confederation, or our first Constitution. Well, after Hamilton created his tax on whiskey, the farmers who made the whiskey got mad about it because these farmers didn't have a whole lot of cash, and they used this whiskey like money. They used it for trade. Now, if they didn't have a whole lot of cash, how were they going to pay the taxes on this? So, when the tax collectors came around, the farmers attacked them, and they started burning down buildings. Well, Washington was having none of this time. He immediately decided to crush the rebellion by sending an army, and the rebellion collapsed as soon as the army crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Now, Washington wanted to send a message to the people, and his message was violent protest would not be tolerated. If the government did something that the people didn't like, then they had to go through the proper channels, which was Congress, to get their grievances taken care of. They weren't going to take matters into their own hands and start rebellions and start shooting. Well, after the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton's plan began to work, and our country's financial situation started to slowly improve. Now, here is the thinking map for Hamilton's plan. After the Revolutionary War, the United States went into a huge financial debt, and they went into a depression. They owed other countries, they owed other states, and they owed all the people. To fix the problem, Alexander Hamilton came up with a plan. His plan was to create a good financial reputation and strengthen the country at the same time. He was going to do this by paying off other countries and the states and the people. And he thought making good on the loans would establish that good financial reputation. And he thought this would make the people want the country to be successful. Now, there was some opposition to his plan in Congress. During the Revolution, the government had borrowed money from the people in the form of bonds, and the people had sold these bonds to speculators for half price. Well, Congress thought if they paid full value for the bonds, they were going to make the speculators rich, and they didn't really want to do that, but in the end they decided to. The real opposition from the plan came from the southern states. These states had accumulated a lot less war debt than the northern states, and they had paid most of it off. And if the governor agreed to pay everybody's war debt, then the southern states were going to end up paying more, and they didn't think it was fair, so they didn't back Hamilton's plan. So he made a deal with the southern states that if they backed his plan, then he would make sure the new capital end up in the South, and they agreed. So the next part of his plan, he thought he needed a national bank to make his plan work. And Jefferson and Madison thought this was unconstitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can create a national bank. Well, Hamilton said, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that I can't create a national bank. So he used the elastic clause to justify his bank. Washington agreed, and he got his bank. The last part of his plan had to do with tariffs and taxes, and they were to create more money for the government. So he created a small tariff on imports and several taxes, including one on whiskey. Well, this made the farmers mad because their whiskey was like cash for them, and when the tax collectors came around, they attacked them and they burned down buildings. Well, Washington wasn't having any of this, and he sent an army to squash the rebellion. And as soon as the army crossed the mountains, the rebellion was over, and Washington was basically sending the message to the people, violent protest will not be tolerated. Well, after the Whiskey Rebellion was all settled, Hamilton's plan began to work, and the country started to get better. And that's it for Hamilton's plan, kid. Use the thinking map to write your essay, and get your note takers done, and let's put all this together in the notebook. The notebook will be the thinking map on this side, your note taker attached to this as a flappy. I want you to draw a picture of Hamilton by hand, color it, and I want you to make sure it looks exactly like him. And then I want you to use the thinking map to write your essay on Hamilton's plan, type it up on Edmodo, print it out, and glue it into your notebook. Thanks, kids, and have a great day.